As we begin this project to engage the parts of our legs that we've been neglecting, we need to understand what extending the legs specifically means. We need to know the trajectory of the movements we're trying to make. We might imagine it's as simple as pushing the foot away from the body. But even then, are you pushing the heel down, or the toes down, or both down? We must also consider the rotation of the leg. We could pull the toes very far out, or we could pull the heel very far out. You may find it interesting to sit back in a chair, or sit back on a bed, or even lie on the ground, and test out how you can twist your legs. Can you make the same movements with both legs, or can you make movements with one of your legs that you can't with the other leg? Try to pull the heel down while twisting back and forth. Try pulling the toes down while twisting. Just doing this can help you see that the musculature of the thighs is often asymmetric and not fully being used. With this figurine, we can see that the common habit of tilting the pelvis forward and down at the front does what's called flexion of the hip joint. Basically, we have this shortening of the musculature that connects the legs to the front of the body. And then the opposite movement, extension, becomes difficult unless the muscles are released. That's a problem because we aren't going to release these muscles while standing. So instead, we see that people perpetually keep their pelvis pulled down at the front in a shortening contraction. We want lengthening contractions of the musculature, which means we want to get extension in the hip joints, not while releasing the musculature, but while still engaging it. You do not have to shorten a muscle to contract it. That is a misconception, and it's been shown in many studies that lengthening contractions are more efficient because they tap into the spring-like properties of muscle. When you get more experience with keeping the front of your pelvis up to get these lengthening contractions, the musculature will have more elastic stiffness. It will resist deformation, and so it will become easier over time to not fall back into this shortening habit. So as we talk about this idea of extending the legs away from the body, it's obvious that we are also talking about extending the torso away from the legs. Even if you're quite familiar with the idea of lifting the iliacs back and up away from the knees, see if this idea of extending the pelvis away from the legs doesn't slightly change how you think about the adjustment. As we begin to look at what we're going to do with the legs, we must bear in mind that anything we do must be coordinated with this lifting at the front of the pelvis, something I've spoken about frequently, and given the directions to lift the points we called the iliacs back and up away from the knees. The common habit that you will see in people with postural issues is that they tend to narrow the backs of their legs. They tend to turn the toes out and narrow the heels. This makes sense. If your tendency is to push the pelvis forward and down at the front, the femurs, the bone of the upper leg, will rotate. The head of the femur, that connects into the hip joint, will go forward. The greater trochanter on the outside of the femur will go backwards. This will narrow the back and overly widen the front. So our first big idea is that we want to get the greater trochanter to rotate forward and in, while the heel rotates out. We want to essentially rotate the entire leg out at the back to widen the back. But there are a couple of majorly important considerations here. First, obviously the front of the pelvis has to go back and up at the same time, which means that the upper end of the leg also has to go back in space. So even though the greater trochanter is rotating forward, it has to move back in space. If you have not seen any of my older videos or taken any lessons and you're coming to this fresh, you may find that nuanced movement difficult to make. Maybe you won't, but many will find that challenging. Part of the challenge is that most people are habitually tending to pull the upper end of their rib cage back. This helps compensate and counterbalance the habitual moving forward of the pelvis. And so, if you get the pelvis and greater trochanters back in space and your upper rib cage is still leaning back, you will fall over backwards So even when we work intently with the legs, what's happening in the torso is highly relevant. We need to unlean the rib cage and get the upper end forward as the pelvis moves back. Next, you must make sure you're not narrowing your thighs. It's possible you could take what I've said and massively narrow your knees and thighs at the front to get this widening at the back. That is not what we want. So we need to make sure that we're getting this same outward rotation at the lower end of the thigh, just above the knee. But even with all this outward rotation, we want to stay on the inside of our feet and not let our ankle or knee buckle outwards. By getting a rotation forward and inward at the greater trochanter, and also the head of the fibula, and the outer malleolus, this outer bump on the ankle, we can maintain our weight on the insides of the legs even as we abduct the legs, that is, move them apart. So the trajectory for extending our legs away from our body is this rotation out at the back and in from the side, while moving back at the top, but also apart from the inside and at the heel. This should make your legs feel more stiff in that they will resist deformation. We can again look at this figurine to model out the habitual movements people make and go through the movements that extend the legs away from the body. One way to play with this is to stand in front of a wall and put your hands on the wall. Step back with one foot, landing on the toes and not the heel. Don't move your torso back when you step back. Just move the leg back. What most people will find is that their pelvis will go down at the front, especially on the side where they stepped back. Does the pelvis have to go down? Or can you lift your iliacs? You will also likely see that you bent your knee when you moved it back. Can you straighten your knee out? Can you press your heel down, not all the way to the ground, but just down? Can you at the same time lift your iliac so your pelvis stays upright? Most will find they struggle with this because it requires significant extension of the legs. If your habit is to never get this extension, it will not be an easy gesture to make. So play a little with this. Can you get your heel down and your iliac up in this configuration? Can you keep your pelvis squared off forward when you step back? If we ever want to walk with due tension in our torso and legs, we have to be quite capable of making this gesture. If you're a more advanced student, make sure you're keeping your torso lengthened as you step back. Can you not retract your head or upper sternum at all during the gesture? As always, the way to understand what you're doing during this gesture is to record yourself with video or have a mirror. You need to see what you're doing. You need visual feedback. Your feeling sense can easily deceive you with a gesture like this. You might think your pelvis is staying up at the front, but the video will tell you the truth. This basic conception of getting extension of the legs will help us as we get started on the knees. The knees have all this elastic tissue in the form of tendons, ligaments, and fascia at the front. This elastic tissue needs to be stretched and made taut for it to function. But how do you stretch the front of your knee? Join me next week and we'll get into it.